In this tutorial, I'm showing you how to create a model composite shot on a shoestring budget. The goal is to achieve the realistic photographic feel of the special effects in the original Star Wars trilogy using stuff you can find at the store or around the house. The trick to getting that feel is limiting computer manipulation and relying more on what you get straight out of the camera. To start, let's focus on the green screen. I tend to use green poster board from office supply stores, the kind with foam backing because it's easy to prop up on its own. Cloth is better because it doesn't reflect light and create uneven highlights. If tacking it to the wall is not an option, just find a big piece of plywood and drape it over that. Now let's talk about the model. You want one that isn't too heavy or valuable. Whatever you find, be it a model or a toy, will invariably need modification like weathering, adding internal lighting, and drilling holes to mount it on a rig. And remember that the realism of the result is very much dependent on the model. At the very least, you'll need to add weathering. Most Star Wars toys are very clean, unlike their appearance on film. Oil paints work well for this. Mix a small amount of paint with a lot of thinner to make an oil wash. Lather it on and rub off the excess. If the model comes with a stand, that's great, but either way you'll need some way of suspending it in front of the green screen. The lighter the model is, the easier it is to find a way of doing that. If your software can create garbage mats, then don't worry about covering your armature. It might cause green spillage on the model, and fixing that is harder than matting out the rig. Lighting is the most important step in compositing as well as photography in general. If you're trying to match a foreground object shot separate from the background, you must match the lighting in both. If you overlook this, the result will suffer. I recommend cool white fluorescent bulbs. So find some clamp lights, desk lamps, whatever's available, and start from scratch in a dark room. Space has only one light source, and that's the nearest star. If your background is deep space, then you should use a single key light. Move it far and low to achieve harsh contrast and sharp shadows. Use a bounce card as well if you want to see the dark areas. If the ship passes in front of a brightly colored planet, find a bounce card of similar color to further blend the two elements. Light the green screen from either side at an angle where the lights won't interfere with the model. You'll probably notice at this point that the shadows on your model are filled with spillage from the green screen. If that happens, either move the screen farther back from the model or use a fill light to flesh out the spillage. With that, let's talk about the camera. You want the best you can afford because you need high resolution and manual controls for exposure. Use a wide-angle lens if you can for its deep focus and distortion of scale. If you use a long lens with a shallow depth of field, you'll reveal the actual size of your model. If you know what the tilt shift effect is, then you understand that your goal is the opposite. For now, I have a basic 50mm lens, so deep focus will be a challenge for me. Mount your camera and frame the shot. Set the white balance to be correct for the model, not the screen. In fact, shut off the lights for the screen and then set the white balance. Don't have the ISO set any higher than 200 or the image will be grainy. Set the exposure as low as the available light will allow because a smaller aperture will give you deeper focus. Compensate with a longer exposure time. When focusing, you want to find a middle ground where the model is just sharp enough from front to back. Take test shots as you adjust focus because what you see in the viewfinder is not necessarily the final result. If you're going to take live action footage, use a high shutter speed to reduce the amount of motion blur. You'll need a lot more light for this, otherwise you're forced to boost the ISO, causing a grainy image. If you intend to create motion with animation, you can take stills and reduce the amount of light needed with a slow shutter speed. Sometimes I use a full second of exposure or more. I prefer this method for that reason, as well as taking advantage of the higher resolution. Creating motion is the trickiest part and can make or break the effect. Any jerkiness will destroy the shot. If the movement from the ship doesn't match the angle it's facing or the movement of the background, then you failed. Handheld shots, whether you're holding the camera or the model on a stick, can only work if you're very careful. For my purposes, I've built a tracking rig with a ruler for stop animation. I also took this rotating snack tray and added a protractor to give the model a point of articulation. For the most part, these effects are accomplished by moving the camera rather than the model. This makes lighting much easier to control, and the model can be saved from the stress. Obviously, moving shadows across the surface can add another dynamic to the shot, but generally a static lighting situation is effective enough. When planning the shot, you should check the composition and focus at the beginning, middle, and end of the motion. If the depth of field is great enough, you shouldn't have to adjust focus midway through. If the ship rotates in your shot, then rotate the model on something like my snack tray. You could even mount it sideways so your ship can change its pitch and then correct the angle in post. If your software can create artificial motion, then take advantage of that as well. I've done several shots where I simply rotate the ship and add lateral movement later on. Be aware though that the computer manipulation will be noticeable as such, so limit your use of it. If you're using a system like mine where shots can be repeated exactly, then I would recommend two passes, one lit with emphasis on a good key and the other with the ship lit against complete darkness. This way, interference between the model and the green screen is eliminated. You can do a third pass just for the internal lighting as well, should that require different exposure settings, whether they be too dim under studio lights or so bright that they interfere with the lighting of the hull. In my opinion, however, if you don't absolutely positively need a third pass, then don't bother because two passes lining up is enough of a miracle. By the time the footage gets to your computer, the most you should have to concentrate on is matting out your rigging. If the screen was lit evenly and the subject lit just right, you should only need some minor color correcting and the key should be a cinch every time. If keying out the screen takes any more work than applying the filter, you didn't work hard enough in the studio. That being said, there's nothing so horrible it can't be saved through editing, so here we go. When you're first applying the chroma key filter, have your footage placed above a white background. I usually have a timeline separate from the final edit to work on keying and matting my footage. With the preview window as large as you can make it, start adjusting the chroma key settings until you have a clean image. When the key is as clean as you can make it, export a test render to see any mistakes that aren't apparent in the low resolution preview window. If the model has too much spillage, this is what I do. I apply a color correction filter underneath the chroma key and boost the red gain as far as I need to. Then I apply a second color corrector above the key filter and reduce the red gain by the exact same amount. If the screen isn't green enough, you have the reverse problem, and if you have both issues, it becomes a balancing act between the red and the green gain. With the two-pass composite shot, have the footage shot with emphasis on keying placed above the beauty pass. Perfect the key on the top layer and invert the effect so you can see the ship in the beauty pass. Finally, boost the green gain on your top layer to make keying this footage even easier later on. Now you'll have to render, export, and re-import this shot. You lose some resolution, but you'll have a beautifully lit model and it'll be easy to key the screen again. Once the key is perfect, you can mat out the stand for the model and any other garbage that ended up in the frame. Take time to make this perfect. If the mat moves with keyframes, make sure it's in perfect time with the footage. This step can be a project all on its own. Once you have a timeline filled with all your keyed footage, it becomes a simple matter to drop it into your main timeline. The hardest part is already done and you're free to concentrate on motion and composition, the fun part of this process. So that's everything you need to know about this, except that like everything else you need to practice. If you followed every step in this tutorial and still don't have a usable special effects shot, don't be discouraged, just try again. You can only improve as you learn from mistakes.